Do you like cocktails? I know I do. And if you're anything else like me, you're curious about what that is that you're drinking. What's the history of that cocktail? How did it come to be? Why is it made the way it is? And why is that glass so funny looking? Hi, I'm Justin Fedicolis. In the next few minutes, we'll take a look at all of that and more when it comes to the story behind two of America's favorite libations. So in this session, we're going to review the cocktail glass itself. It's the vessel for the drink, so it's important that you know about it. Then we'll take a look at those two classic cocktails, the Martini and the Manhattan. They're cousins. So what's the origin, recipe, and variations of these two classic drinks? And then finally, what about some other classic cocktails out there? There's a whole extended family of beverages, and we'll take a look at three of what I think are also the most classic and interesting of cocktails. The cocktail glass itself has a very specific purpose, a very specific design, yet it's completely misunderstood. Here's the cocktail glass. Many people call it a martini glass since the majority of drinks served in said glass are a variation of a martini, but it's really the cocktail glass. It's made up of two distinct features. First is a triangle or cone-shaped bowl sitting on top of a long, thin stem. Each of these features has a distinct purpose. Let's take the stem, for example. Many beverages served in this type of glass are served without ice. So if you would hold the glass by the bowl, the warmth of your hands would warm the drink, and that doesn't make a good cocktail. So by holding it by the stem, it keeps the cocktail chilled as it's enjoyed. Well, what about that bowl? Besides being the nemesis of anybody trying to carry a full beverage across a crowded floor or even up a flight of stairs, it places the surface of the cocktail under the nose. Think of this. Many beverages served in this type of glass have a lot of aromatic elements to it. So by having a large surface area placed directly under your nose, you get to experience more of those aromatics. The average size, or volume I should say, of a cocktail glass is about 4.5 ounces. I've seen some even bigger, but to be responsible and enjoy your cocktail, 4.5 to maybe even 6 ounces is probably the max I'd recommend. Drinks served in a cocktail glass, as I mentioned before, are shaken or stirred with ice to chill the drink and then strained to put inside. In many cases, when ordering a cocktail in this type of glass, someone would say they want it straight up or up. The terms are sometimes used also to describe any liquor served by itself without mixers or even ice. To be more accurate, the proper term for those types of cocktails is order it neat. A variation of a cocktail served in this type of glass would be on the rocks, which, you guessed it, means adding ice. And there's pros and cons to this. The pro of having a cocktail on the rocks is that drink is going to stay a lot colder because the ice is in the drink. The con or the downside of that, well, because the ice is in the drink, you risk the drink watering it down. I know when I have cocktails in the summertime, I sometimes have them on the rocks, but I can definitely taste a difference once I get down a little bit lower and I can taste the dilution going on there. Let's talk about my favorite cocktail of all times. It is the martini. It is my go-to cocktail before dinner. It's somewhere where if I'm going out to a nice restaurant and I want to have a nice cocktail before dinner, I reach for that martini. It's a classic. So what is a martini? Well, it's blank, flavored with blank, garnished with blank. Aren't you glad you took this course? Let's fill in those blanks. A traditional martini is gin, flavored with dry vermouth, and garnished with an olive. Where did the martini come from? Well, there's three theories on the origin of this cocktail. First is that it's based on a common late 19th century cocktail, which was made with gin, a very prevalent spirit at the time, and Italian vermouth. A popular manufacturer was Martini and Rossi, so since gin was very generic, the name martini stuck. The second theory is that the martini we know today is based off of the Martinez cocktail. This was popular at the Occidental Hotel in San Francisco, and many patrons would enjoy this cocktail before boarding the ferry back to Martinez. The beverage also contained triple sec and maraschino liqueur, in my opinion, a far cry from what a martini is like today, so I choose not to believe this theory. The third, and probably more common one, I would say, is that it's named after someone named Martini. The most popular one I've found in my research was that he was a bartender at the Knickerbocker Hotel in New York City. He created this cocktail in around 1911, so people would ask for Martini's cocktail, and eventually, the martini. Enough talk, how do you make one? Well, the martini is a very simple cocktail. As we talked about before, there's really only two main ingredients, right? Gin and dry vermouth. But it's all about the ratio of gin to vermouth. That's what makes the difference. The early recipes have, in my opinion, probably one of the most disgusting ratios of gin to vermouth. Equal parts 1-to-1. No, not at all. The modern recipe ever increases the ratio of gin to vermouth. 8-to-1, 12-to-1, or even 100-to-1. Now, 100-to-1 doesn't mean you sit out 100 counts of gin to 1 count of vermouth. Basically, it's just a touch of that vermouth. In many cases, I've seen bartenders briefly swirl the ice with vermouth or put it in the glass and then dump it out. There's actually some really cool quotes about using vermouth in the martinis. 3 of them real quick. First is from a Spanish filmmaker who said he loved to place vermouth bottle next to the martini glass and let the sun shine through it and shine onto the martini. Noel Coward, who's an English playwright, used to like to face Europe as he had his martinis so that he could kind of see where Italy would kind of sort of be, and that's where vermouth came from, and that's about enough vermouth for him. And really the most fun one is Winston Churchill, the former British Prime Minister. He would love to have his martini, and before he'd take a sip, he'd just whisper, "Vermouth." And that's all the vermouth he enjoyed. When making a martini, do you stir it or do you shake it? I personally prefer to stir a martini. It maintains the gin's delicate nature and it dilutes the drink much less, so you really taste the flavor of that gin. Shaking it chills it very quickly, and when you go to a bar, that's the dramatic effect that you see all the bartenders. They have that metal mixing tin, and you hear the martinis going all over the place. Everyone looks around and sees that martini. I like to stir it. If you like to shake it, no harm, no foul. And it's always garnished with an olive. In many cases, a plain olive or stuffed with a bright red pimento. My preference, piece of blue cheese. A blue cheese olive in a martini is a great accent. Up until this point, we've been talking about gin martinis. But what about a vodka martini? Well, true to form, a martini is originally made with gin. But vodka martinis, especially in the late half of the 20th century, have become very, very popular, thanks in part to one man, Bond. James Bond. That's the only impression you're going to get out of me right now. If there's any fans of the Bond movies and 007, specifically take a look at the movie Casino Royale. That will dictate Bond's very specific recipe for his favorite martini. More on that later. So how do you know if someone's drinking a vodka martini? Well, almost always the key indicator is going to be a lemon twist garnish, and that goes very well with vodka, and more so than gin, I think. So that's really how you're going to tell if someone has a vodka martini. Vodka is traditionally flavorless. So again, I'm a gin martini purist. I don't understand why somebody would want vodka, but one thing that vodka does well is it extracts lots of flavors out of other items. So infused vodkas can make for great cocktails. I had a chili pepper infused vodka martini one time at a restaurant, and it went really well with the dinner I had. For dessert, you can have an espresso or a pineapple infused vodka martini. Great, great cocktails. And while we're on the subject of different types of martinis, let's do a little activity. Here are 5 different accepted martini variations: the Gibson, the Vesper, Bronx Martini, Dirty Martini, and Perfect Martini. And here are 5 different preparations. Let's take a minute and see if you can figure out which martini variation is prepared using which method. Let's talk the Gibson. This is made with an onion garnish. It's prepared the exact same way as a martini, but you swap out the olive for an onion. Personally, I kind of like this a little bit more than a martini, but don't tell my blue cheese stuffed olive that. The Vesper, now that contains the gin, vodka, and Lillet. The Lillet replaces the vermouth. This is 007's martini. I had one time recently at an oyster house, and let me tell you, the Vesper martini went perfectly with some oysters, so that's a good pairing, and I'd recommend you try it, even if you're not a British spy. The Bronx martini, you take the base recipe and add orange juice to it. Yeah, I'm not going to talk about that one anymore either. The Dirty Martini has olive brine added. This is a very common one. I see people order dirty martinis. I've seen everything from just a splash of olive brine to even replace the vermouth, to the bartender emptying out the garnish tray and the drink is literally green. I'm not a fan. I like to have my olive garnish. I don't really want to taste it in every sip. But if you like it, this is very, very popular. Based on process of elimination, the perfect martini is equal parts sweet and dry vermouth. I've never really tried this. Honestly, I'd prefer saving my sweet vermouth for another recipe, but don't be surprised if you think you want to order a great martini and say, make it perfect, and your bartender gives you a beverage that may be a little bit different than what you expected. Here's classic cocktail number 2, the Manhattan. This is a cocktail that I can really associate with my father. I can remember as I was growing up, we lived in a neighborhood where all the kids went on camping trips and a couple of the dads took turns going with us. And I can remember my father and our one neighbor sitting by the campfire having Manhattans all night long. When I was old enough to begin enjoying cocktails, I started having these, and I can really understand why this went well with a fire. I also like to have Manhattans paired with food, and this may sound weird, but if you're a fan of General Tso's chicken, have a Manhattan with it. Your life will be changed forever. So what is a Manhattan, besides an island in New York? Well, it's whiskey, sweetened with red or Rosso vermouth, flavored with bitters, and garnished with a cherry. So again, that classic cocktail of taking base spirits, adding to it, but keeping it very, very simple. Also, like the martini, there's a couple theories of how the Manhattan cocktail came to be. The first one is that it was a cocktail that was very popular at the Manhattan Club around 1870 or so. I think what's interesting about this is it was served at a dinner party hosted by Lady Randolph Churchill, who was the mother of, you guessed it, a martini-loving Winston Churchill. Unfortunately, this is likely an urban legend because around that time, Lady Churchill was pregnant and known to be in France. The second theory, and probably the most accurate, is that this is based on a style of cocktail. You know, in the 1860s, similar cocktails, a whiskey-based cocktail with different flavorings, was all the rage in New York City. And people who would visit New York City would return back home and ask for a Manhattan-style cocktail. The final theory kind of gives you a chuckle, and I'd love to believe that this is the true one, is that it's a reference to poor water quality in major cities in the second half of the 19th century. Pollution, low sanitary standards, and boom of building made all of the water kind of brownish and not the best looking. So when someone ordered a cocktail, they'd say, "Give me that Manhattan water cocktail." How do you make a Manhattan? Well, the most widely accepted recipe for that cocktail is 2 parts of rye whiskey, 1 part of red or Rosso vermouth, and 2 to 3 dashes of Angostura bitters. You would stir that cocktail, again, not really shaken, stir the cocktail with ice, strain it into a cocktail glass, and garnish it with a Luxardo cherry. If you've never heard of a Luxardo cherry, or you're not sure if you've had a Luxardo cherry before, it's not the bright neon pink maraschino cherry that most bartenders garnish a cocktail with. It's a deep dark red, a deep flavorful garnish, a deep flavorful cherry. Once you've had one, you'll never want to have one of those neon things ever again. Now, Manhattan's made with whiskey. So is it whiskey with an E or whiskey without an E? Well, American rye whiskey is the traditional ingredient for a Manhattan cocktail. And in the United States, in America, whiskey is spelled with an E. However, Canadian whiskey did become a popular base spirit for Manhattans, and Canadian whiskey is spelled without the E. When did it become popular? Well, during Prohibition, of course, when American distilleries were not permitted to make whiskey, the beverage, or the spirit, I should say, was imported north of the border. But of course, bourbon, blended, and Tennessee whiskeys are all commonly used today to make Manhattans. And the Manhattan is one of the cocktails where there's a lot of room to experiment and really allow bartenders and mixologists to show their skill and knowledge of making classic cocktails. The first is to use various types of homemade cherries. Like I mentioned before, Luxardo, a premium garnish, is the most common, but you could use cherries that have been marinated in bourbon, for example, or even some red wine or port or something like that. So I know one year for Thanksgiving, I decided to get some dried cherries and soak them for a week in Canadian Club so that they would plump up and really add to some great flavor to my Manhattans. You could also use various different bitters. The traditional one, obviously, like I mentioned, is Angostura. It's very herbaceous and spicy. But you could also use Peychaud's bitter, which is lighter and sweeter, or orange bitters, which adds a brightness or a freshness to the cocktail. I tend to actually combine multiple bitters. I use about 2 or 3 dashes of Angostura and about 4 to 5 dashes of orange bitters. That adds a really interesting flavor combination. You can also try switching out the base spirit of the cocktail. So again, American rye whiskey or rye whiskey is what usually the Manhattan's made of, but there's some interesting type of Manhattan-based cocktails out there. Let's talk about some Manhattan-based cocktails where the base spirit is not what you think. First is the Rob Roy. It replaces whiskey with what? Scotch, gin, or rum? It's Scotch. It adds a slight enhanced depth of flavor that the Scotch brings that really makes it quite interesting. What about a Manhattan made with Southern comfort? What's it called? It's called the Southern Manhattan. Personally, I'd like it to be called the Atlanta. I think it would be a really neat nod, and maybe there's some bar down south that does call it that, but it's the Southern Manhattan. Here's one that, if you paid attention earlier in the course, you should be able to pick up. A perfect Manhattan has equal parts of what? Choose 2. If you paid attention, you'd be doing sweet vermouth and dry vermouth. Just like a perfect martini, a perfect Manhattan, equal parts. And finally, a Cuban Manhattan. What replaces the whiskey in this drink? Dark rum. There's a local distillery where I live that makes an old-fashioned with their bourbon barrel-aged rum, and it's phenomenal. Now, those are 2 of the most common classic cocktails, but there's a lot of other ones out there, and I'd like to explore a couple of them right now with you. My criteria for exploring these cocktails is they need to have similar characteristics to the two that we talked about. First, they must be served in that cocktail glass, that tall triangle or cone-shaped glass. They must be officially recognized by the International Bartenders Association as a cocktail. Just because a bartender or a restaurant added teeny to the end of a cocktail, so the flirtini, the pineapple teeny, the espresso teeny, that's not a classic cocktail. Great marketing, not a cocktail. And finally, there needs to be that simple recipe where there's one main spirit followed by at least one flavoring or sweetener to bring out the different aromas and the characteristics of that spirit. Here's the first one, the daiquiri. Now, before you think I've lost my mind, no. This is not what I'm talking about. Not that frozen tub that you get out of your freezer and scrape with a spoon. It's not one that you'd see walking on the Las Vegas Strip with a plastic yard glass and a giant straw that's in neon colors. No. This is the daiquiri. It's a classic cocktail made with white rum, lime juice, and simple syrup. It's credited to an American in Cuba, and it's actually named after a beach, Daiquiri Beach. It's popular in the 1940s, and that's because other spirits were rationed due to the war, and Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy allowed for easy Latin American trade of the key ingredients of rum and sugarcane. Next, the Cosmopolitan, more commonly, the Cosmo. It's a cocktail made with citrus vodka, triple sec, lime juice, and cranberry juice. It was created in the 1970s as a hybrid of two other classic cocktails, the Cape Codder, which is vodka and cranberry juice, and the Kamikaze, which is lime juice with vodka. It gained popularity in the 1990s from a prominent feature in the show Sex and the City. When I see people order the Cosmo, I tend to take a look and see what color it is. It's how I judge if the bartender really knows about this drink. In my opinion, the Cosmo really should have just a hint of cranberry juice. It's basically more so a Kamikaze. Add just enough cranberry juice to change the color of the drink and add that bright fruity flavor. And finally, the margarita. Yes, the margarita is a classic cocktail. Don't believe me? Let's take a look at the recipe. It's 2 parts tequila, 1 part Cointreau, and 1 part lime juice. It follows the recipe. However, this cocktail I think is served in the cocktail glass the least amount of time. Most often you'll see it frozen or on the rocks. I'm an on the rocks guy. And just like every other classic cocktail, there's an origin story, and there's 3 theories I've done some research on that could be most plausible as to how the margarita got its name. The first is in the 1930s, a retired Ziegfeld girl, a showgirl, went to Baja, Mexico, and in that cantina, they decided to make a drink for her. Her name was Marjorie King. She went by Margarita. In 1941, there was a daughter of an ambassador. Her name was Margarita as well, and she was the first person to have a new drink, so they named it after her. The third, and I think the most fun theory, but I don't know how accurate it is it's named after singer Peggy Lee. You know, she sang the song Fever. I'm not going to sing it for you. I think you all know what it is. Go with me on this. She enjoyed this cocktail. Her name is Peggy. Peggy is short for Margaret. Another nickname for Margaret? Margarita. Which one do you think is right? We're just about at the end of the course. I'd like you to remember these 3 things. First, the cocktail glass. It's built for a purpose. Remember, the stem to hold it, to keep your glass chilled, and that bowl with the large surface area to make sure you get all of those aromas. Second, the 2 classic cocktails are cousins, the Martini and the Manhattan. They have mysterious origins, a basic recipe, and multiple variations to really let the talent of those mixologists shine. And there's a wide variety of other classic cocktails that follow the same rule. It has to be recognized, served in the cocktail glass, and a simple recipe of a base spirit, flavorings, and a garnish. I really hope you enjoyed this course, and I hope you are interested in learning more from me or about me. You can visit my LinkedIn page, linkedin.com/in/Justin Pedicolis, or follow me on Twitter @Justin Pedicolis. Thanks for watching, and enjoy those cocktails responsibly.